Hello everyone, my name's Alan. We're going to be talking about data visualization today, but kind of from the challenges that mostly come up, in my experience, when people are facing this. So this is my third time speaking at this conference, and it's always a good experience for me. It's great to meet the range of people that you get in these kind of rooms, this very packed room, as I can see. I'm slightly an oddity when it comes to speaking at this conference because I'm not a data scientist. I don't come from an analyst background, I'm not a statistician. What I do is I talk to people about how they can communicate better. And a lot of the people that I work with are either data scientists or people from the wider scientific community, people working in finance, people working in technology, people who have in some way complex information that they're often trying to communicate to a lay audience or an audience who doesn't have the same set of background experience, knowledge that they do. And that's where the challenges start to come in. In some ways, when I'm doing this, I'm effectively a professional idiot, because what I'm doing a lot of the time is sitting in rooms with people saying, I don't get it. I don't understand this, and if you can't explain it to me, then you're going to struggle to explain it to your CEO or your marketing team or your customers. So I'm trying to endlessly try to distill down what are very complex messages into something that people can understand quite quickly. And the reason that's important is that if we don't get often other people to understand what we're telling them, the complexities of the data or the model or how we approach a particular project, then we don't get things done at the other end. We don't get decisions made, we don't get behaviour change, we don't get certain actions carried out, and that's what we're usually trying to do. So my background with all of this is, as was mentioned, I came through working in journalism, and that does inform my approach. I'm often diving into subjects that I know not so much about and trying to get down to, okay, what is the core meaning? I then work with all kinds of other organisations, from public sector, private sector, large corporates, tech startups, charities and NGOs, and I find that there's a fairly consistent set of problems that come up. And they often come up from, as I say, this point where we are trying to do this communication with people who don't understand as much as us. Now, this is an oversimplified diagram compared to all the other things you'll see in the other talks today. But this is basically where we're sitting from a communications point of view as a data scientist or an analyst or anyone else who works with data. We have the data itself. It's complicated. There's lots of numbers in it. There's lots of complicated things that we're doing to it. And then we have an audience over there who just wants to know what the answers are. Basically, they want to know what it means, what they should do about it, why it's important, what are the bits they should be looking at. And in the middle is us. Now, there is some visualization work, obviously, that goes on as part of the kind of data analysis. There are things that we do for ourselves when we're looking at a data set or we're mapping out a new project that involve visualization, involve turning things into a way that we can see the patterns and we can see the associations. But the more challenging bit is when we come to then try and visualize that in a way that people can understand it, who have no background knowledge, who have don't have the same skill set as us necessarily. Now, because this is the third time I've spoken at this conference, I'm not going to repeat what I've said in previous years. I did do a talk earlier this year at a meetup for ODSC, so if there are some things that I generally teach when I'm doing training that you can see in that talk, it is online. But what I'm going to cover today is more of the key challenges that I've seen coming up most recently. So this year, when I've been talking to lots of different people, what are the things that keep getting mentioned as this is a problem when it comes to us producing visualizations? I'll go through each of them. For each one, I'm going to suggest a few practical questions that we can ask ourselves or a few practical things that we can put in place that will help us overcome those. But what I also want to do is make sure I leave time at the end for questions. So the only super powerful computer I'm going to be asking you to use during this session is the one that is in your skull. So start thinking as we go through about how this potentially applies to the work that you're doing. Also have a think if you think that's ridiculous. There's no way we'd be able to do that in where I work, because I'd rather tackle those kind of questions as well when we get to the end. So do be building up the questions as we go through. So the first of the challenges that I think this is something that has got worse and is a perpetual problem, is general data literacy, and I mean outside of the field of data science or outside of the data specialist roles. Because data has become recognised and is being used more and more as a way to drive business decisions, but also being surfaced much more in the public domain in things like policy decisions, that gives it a great amount of prominence, but then you hit the problem of the general populace not having necessarily the greatest tools at their disposal to analyse or interpret data. Now, some of this has been worsened by the fact that there are bad actors out there. There are people who are maliciously putting data out into the public domain in a way that is slanted, and they're presenting it in a way that is not honest. We know this because we are in the midst of yet another election in this country. We have a president who's being impeached in the United States, and all over the world there are other politicians particularly who are using data in ways that are dishonest, and journalists who aren't necessarily built to hold them to account in this particular area. This is typical examples of the kind of stuff that we find. This map wasn't actually created by Donald Trump. He normally uses marker pen when he's doing his work. This one was created back, I think, in 2016. It's inaccurate in multiple ways. It's also out of date. But it did get retweeted a lot of times. The point he was trying to make with this particular map is this is the number of, I think it was counties, that voted for Trump, and therefore this is the support I have, and therefore how can you possibly think that you're going to impeach me when this is the base that I am relying on? There are obvious problems with it. But apart from the inaccuracies of the data, the straight inaccuracies, just this way of presenting who voted for who in the United States obviously takes no account of population. As the Wall Street Journal put it, land doesn't vote. And so this is an inaccurate way, however accurate the data is underpinning it, of presenting the information. What it does to someone looking at it is give a clear impression of massive dominance of one side in terms of that map. The always excellent XKCD comic produced a more rational version of the map that took account of population, that each of those figures representing 250,000 people, you suddenly start to see that Kansas isn't as necessarily shouldn't be weighted as the same way as New York or Washington or LA on the other coasts. But as much as this is like a malicious version of presenting data in a misleading way, this kind of way of presenting data comes up in places where people aren't trying to push necessarily an inaccurate message. So we are going to see some version of this map once we hit the general election on the 12th of December. This is the standard way that they will present the results in most newspapers and on most websites. This map suffers exactly the same problems as that one there. We still have places, we still will have colours appearing more dominant and appearing bigger based on landmass and area of places, not based on how many people voted for a given party or a given candidate. And I often see maps presented like this one on the right. This one was presented to me as a crime map of the UK. And it is a crime map of the UK. But generally speaking, anything that human beings do will happen where there's more human beings. And that's the correlation that you're always going to see when you present data in that way. It's not that people on the coast of rural Wales are nicer than anyone else. It's just that if you're a mugger waiting there, you're going to be waiting for a very long time for somebody to mug. Whereas if you go down to London, it's nice and handy. There's lots of people round about you. So these kind of accidental ways of presenting data in a misleading way happen a lot of the time in the press. Partly, although I'm blaming politicians for a lot of this, partly this is down to journalism. Partly, which is my old profession, journalists generally, well, they may well have a slant themselves, they may well have a political stance, but also, generally speaking, journalists did not come from a scientific or mathematical background. Journalists tended to be from a humanities background. That is something that's gradually changing. Data journalism is becoming a bigger deal, but still there are innocent errors that are made all the time. And they go, one of the things you have to think about in terms of how people interpret data is just what visually are they going to take from it in a very, very short space of time. Obviously, that's why visualization is a useful thing, is that we provide a kind of cognitive shortcut to the meaning. And they will look at things like, well, how much blue is there versus how much red? That will go into their brains long before they ever analyze the underlying data or analyze how things work. Or if you want to get really kind of blunt about how you present data, then obviously this single number that was painted on the side of the bus has caused more pain than probably any other data point over the last few years, again, just by giving it prominence. And this, to show how dangerous this kind of deliberate manipulation of data is becoming, bear in mind this is the year that the sequel to the much-loved Vaxxed movie, which is an anti-vaxxer campaigning movie, the sequel, People's Truth, has come out this year, in the same year that the World Health Organization listed vaccination hesitancy as one of the top 10 most, the biggest threats to global health in 2019. So that's alongside Ebola, by the way. So this manipulation of data, there will be lots of graphs and charts in this film, by the way. The manipulation of data, the manipulation of people's ability to process data is happening all the time. But again, it's more the accidental things that I tend to worry about. This is a graph, and the BBC, I should say up front, have done some excellent work on trying to break down the data that's involved in the election. But I found this graph on the BBC website in I think it was a feature on 10 charts you have to know about the NHS. And I'm still struggling with it. I've looked at it for quite a long time, and I still think there's an awful lot going on there in terms of what the actual underlying message is supposed to be. So these are the kind of presentations of data that I would say I see more often. And this happens both in terms of when people are presenting stuff to the public and when people are presenting data internally at organisations, either to senior leadership or to other teams who maybe sit outside of the data specialism but still need to understand the data very quickly. So one of the things that I think we're doing is often overestimating the data literacy of our audiences, and that doesn't mean they're idiots, it just means that they're not necessarily trained in looking at presentations of data all the time. Which means one thing that we can do straight off the bat is be very careful about choosing the graph and chart types that we present to people. As a general rule, this is there's a good website which has nothing to do with me, so there's no sales messages today, but DataViz Catalog is a good breakdown of all the different graph and chart types, which you can filter by either chart type or by function. So you can look at what you're trying to do and it will give you suggestions for the graphs you can use. But as a general rule, I say to people when they're presenting to anyone who is outside of a data specialism is stick to the graph and charts types that you used at school. Those are the ones you're aiming for. They're incredibly accurate and they're incredibly quick to interpret. So things like columns, taller, shorter, people can understand those very, very quickly. Things like lines moving through time, people can understand those very, very quickly. If you move to a more esoteric type of graph or chart, which is either driven by the complexity of the data, or sometimes it's because people feel like they've used too many bar charts and it's getting a bit boring, so they reach for something that's a bit more trendy, like a bubble chart, for instance. The problem with doing that is that if you present people with a graph or chart style that they're not necessarily familiar with, they will have to work out how the actual graph functions before they can look at the numbers and therefore the message that you're presenting to them. Now, what we're trying to do with visualization usually is speed up cognition, is try and speed up how quickly people get to the underlying information. If you present them with something esoteric, then you're actually slowing them down. It actually would have been easier to explain it to them verbally, or possibly to give them the raw numbers, than to present them in something they're unfamiliar with. So be very careful with the graph and chart types you're using to present to people. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with specialist audiences, then you can go and use something more specialist. I've done training and consultancy for people like the Financial Conduct Authority, the Biological and Bioscience Research Council. Those people I expect to be using stuff that I probably don't understand if they're trying to communicate with an audience who is much more specialised than I am. But if you're communicating with a general lay audience, and I would probably include your C-suite, the people who are leaders in your organisation within that, generally you want to choose something simpler. But another thing that we rarely think about when we're presenting data, because it feels very fluffy, is to think about the motivations of the audience that you're communicating with. So by that I mean, what are they likely to care about, and what is likely to get them to delve more into this, or to take this message on board that we're presenting them with. So presenting a bunch of information from one data set, you can present information in a way that is relevant to your marketing team, or is relevant to your finance team, or is relevant to your customers. But those are all likely to be separate styles of visualization, separate presentations of the data. Don't assume that by morphing them all into one, or by using one standard way of presenting the data, that that's necessarily going to appeal to lots of different people. So as an example of this, I think it's perfectly possible to present to a traditional right-wing voter who doesn't particularly care about Extinction Rebellion or that kind of tranche of a protester, present an economic argument for why we should be investing in the green revolution. That will be much more powerful. So it's not changing your message or changing the underlying thing you want to happen based on the motivations of your audience, but it is presenting the side of it that is likely to get their interest most quickly. My example of this often is if you think about, because people always tell me at this point that their data is too complicated to be able to just facet it out in this way. Well, if you think about weather data, which is pretty much the most complex data set you can get in terms of how many data points there are and how quickly they change. So global weather patterns. If I'm leaving my house in the morning and I look at the weather app on my phone, I get a very specific visualization of that data set. It's designed for me. It's geolocated, first of all. I don't care what's happening in different cities. It's not presented in a way that will be suitable for experts, but it's presented in a way that it would be suitable for somebody like me who doesn't know anything about climate science. There's a kind of cartoony landscape, there's a nice big temperature, because the decisions and the motivations that I am thinking about at that point is, I want to know how cold is it, do I need a coat? And is it raining, do I need an umbrella? That's the extent to which I'm delving into the data. Now if you took that same presentation of weather data and you gave it to a climate scientist who was trying to do their job at work, it would be wholly inadequate. It wouldn't give them enough information, it's not how they want to see the data. But thinking from a motivational point of view, what is going to interest people in this, what are they going to want to get out of that, get out of the data, and using that to influence your visualization is a good approach, and often because it feels a bit fluffy, people don't necessarily think in that way. The three things that I usually get people to think about when they're producing a new visualization are audience, story, and action. So who are we speaking to? Who are we presenting this to? What do we want to tell them, and what do we want them to do? Those basic ingredients you need to have in there at some point, and motivations feed into pretty much all of those. So when it comes to data literacy, I don't think it's your job as data scientists or analysts or anything else to necessarily be responsible for improving everyone's data literacy, although there are many campaigns now to try and do this, to train up non-data members of leadership teams to understand what the potential is and what the considerations are, to raise literacy in the general population. There are arguments made that it's very difficult to be a full citizen and a voter unless you have some data literacy. But while all that work is going on, there's probably some practical stuff that we can do. Using graph and chart types that are familiar to people. And if you're thinking, well, my data doesn't fit onto something simple, let's build that into the questions. Be aware of the motivations that people have and how you can tap into those with your visualization. And then if there are opportunities where you can educate people, then be aware of them and try and use them. Is there a way that if you know you're going to present something complicated, that you build a more of a tuition or workshop approach into the presentation you're giving to people? This particularly works well for internal communication within a business or within an organisation. The second thing I wanted to talk about sort of ties into the audience part of that one, which is relatability, which is not my favourite word, and I tried to find an alternative. But this is the idea that people often struggle to understand visualizations or any presentation of data if they don't know what it means for them, or they can't tap into some part of it that is relevant to their lives. And this often ties into a way of just approaching how you're doing any kind of presentation. This you'll often see with things like investor decks from startups, of trying to find a way of presenting both the breadth of the problem and the depth of the problem. So let's imagine this is a tech startup style pitch deck. The breadth of the problem is how many people have this problem, and the depth of the problem is how big a problem is it for one of those individuals. But you can apply that way of thinking to most other types of data you might be presenting. I could replace the word problem with opportunity quite easily here as well. So the idea is, okay, how much of our organisation does this affect, or how much does the population that we're talking about does this affect, and how deeply does it affect them? Now, sometimes people think about that at the start of the project they're undertaking, how they're going to analyse the data, but they don't necessarily carry it through to the actual presentation of the data. And one simple way to often do this is breadth of problem might be your quantitative data, and depth of problem might be something more qualitative. So if I take something like measles as an example, which relates to the vaccine hesitancy that I've been talking about, there's no problem with presenting the actual data that relates to measles and the fact that when vaccinations drop, then incidence of measles increase. But one of the problems with talking about something like measles is that it is, because it's a disease that we got so close to getting rid of entirely, and it means that very few people have an incident of measles that they know about. Somebody in their immediate social circle, somebody in their family. So trying to remind people of what actually getting measles means, alongside how many people get measles, is probably going to be a more powerful way of presenting the actual data. So things like case studies, things like, it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that, but images, things like just including a quote from your customers. If you're talking about some aspect of your product that you want to improve, or some aspect of a service that you want to streamline, then giving the data but also talking about what that means for one of your customers in quotes or in a mini case study. That kind of combination can be very powerful and is an easy way to lift what otherwise looks a bit abstract. This is what I'm trying to say with relatability. It's getting away from it feeling like it's something completely disassociated from my life. That relatability could also tie into if you're talking to particular people from particular departments within an organisation, again, tapping into the thing, what will it mean for them? Rather than what will it mean for the overall organisation as a general thing, what will it mean for their department? How will it improve things or change things for them? Another way that we can look at adding in this kind of relatability, and this often is the case with interactives, or any kind of interactive data visualization you might be presenting, is what Alberto Cairo calls trying to look for the me layer of a visualization. So Alberto Cairo, author of How Charts Lie, which is a recent book, he pulls out things like this visualization, which is of salaries in different sectors of the industry in the US. It's produced for the Wall Street Journal. And it's been very, very popular. Huge number of page views, huge number of interactions, lots of shares online and things like that. And the key thing that has made it as compulsive or as engaging as it is that people can obviously map themselves onto that particular interactive. Now, this is something that I know from looking at website analytics of various different types of content for magazines, for newspapers, where you give people the ability to interact, they're likely to engage much more than if it's something they passively can take in. So something they can look at, something they can watch. If it's something they can actually get hands-on with, particularly if you imagine on touch screens, then they will engage with it more. But then if you can add that me layer of, well, where do I fit into this? It becomes almost compulsive that they want to see where they can fit in. Now, it's harder to add the me layer when you are doing something like a PowerPoint presentation or writing a report, because you have a lot of me's in your audience and there isn't that layer of interactivity. But always trying to look for a way of making this something that is concrete in people's lives, concrete in their minds, not something that is totally abstract and just out there. And another way that we can make things more relatable, and this is part of getting away from it being abstract as well, is to give people a sense of scale. The sense of scale is something that I often see is missing from visualizations, particularly where we're talking about millions and billions. Those kind of numbers quickly become abstract. Above about, 1 million is a lot, 5 million is a lot, 500 million is a lot. If you don't give me some idea of how they fit into the wider world, then I get very stuck on knowing what kind of thing we're talking about. Should I really be caring about this? The billion-poundogram, which you can see, various people have done versions of this. You can see it on Information is Beautiful, and they do an updated version, which just breaks down a bunch of stuff that have been quoted in millions of pounds, but puts them next to each other, inside each other, in a kind of tree map format to give people an idea of what that actually looks like. So this one here, I think, is US. Oh no, this is UK based. But it puts things like costs of bailouts of banks versus amount of income tax brought in versus the amount of revenue that Tesco makes. They are usually around a certain theme. The NHS down there, 102 billion. They're usually around a certain theme or a geographical location, but the sheer idea of this is just to give people a conceptual idea of what these big numbers mean that you don't get with the numbers in isolation. Other ways that you can often add that sense of scale are comparison points. So whenever you read about something in the news that might be very, very long, then often they will give you the length in double-decker buses. And if it's area, it will be football fields or tennis courts, and if it's volume, it will be swimming pools. Those obviously aren't mathematical units, they are just handy ways of providing people with the ability to keep these numbers in their heads. Nobody really has a concept of 100 cubic meters of water, but if you give it to them in swimming pools, they've got some chance of being able to place that in their world and in their mind. So comparison points, putting things in context like this, or the third way of doing it is some idea of trajectory. Often numbers given in isolation make very little sense to people, but giving people growth rates or an idea of this is where it is now, this is where it was, and potentially this is where it might be, that idea of is it going up or down is the other way you can provide that kind of context. So relatability is the message, the thing you're trying to get across with your data visualization. Is it something that is relatable to your audience? Is it something that they think will matter? Is it something that they will care about? Is it something that fits into their lives, professional or personal? Have you provided that context and scale? Have you given them an idea of how big these numbers are, or how they compare to other things, the trajectory of them, or some reasonable comparison point that allows them to make sense of it? And is there a way to add in that me layer? Can you get down to the point of them pinpointing exactly where they or their department or their business appears within that data that you're showing to them? Now, one of the things I showed you there with the measles idea, and that's my next point, is use of imagery. Now, this is something that people do try and do, and there are practical problems with it, as well as, I guess, more problems of theoretical approach. We know that imagery, well, I hope you all know, that imagery on things like online blog posts or on social media, it increases engagement, it's more likely to catch people's eye. Images used sensibly within reports or within PowerPoint presentations are more likely to engage an audience. But obviously, when we're talking about data science, and really anything that's technical and anything that's complicated and anything that's potentially abstract, we tend to get down to a very narrow set of stock images very, very quickly. So anything about growth in business, we're going to get variations on this kind of idea. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, and probably the first time it was done, it was probably quite clever, but the effect wears off fairly quickly. Anything to do with the environment is probably a little bit sci-fi and a little bit spiritual, something like that. Anything to do with cybersecurity and hacking, we have our standard kind of merging of somebody in a hoodie with the Matrix. One of those two things gets forced through. I'm sure if you guys read blog posts about machine learning or AI, you have seen variations of this kind of image hundreds and thousands of times. Again, nothing inherently wrong with it, but you will see it all over the place, and as a result, it's very unlikely to have specific meaning for you. Or the fallback position for these kind of stock images is often, can we just put something on a keyboard and make it look a bit relevant? I'm not sure. That's a fairly underwhelming image for showing the scale and importance of big data, but it's kind of a sign of desperation for how else do you visualize big data. Now, this is an area that organisations who work with a lot of imagery and do this professionally have started to put more and more work into this, because they've realised that actually these kind of cliched images, although I've shown you the kind of stock image approach, they do crop up in lots of different places. Interesting projects that I've seen. One, for instance, this is a project by photographer Heather Hazan, done in conjunction with the American Academy for Pediatrics and Self magazine. And all it was is they produced a free, shareable, open source library of images that relate to vaccinations to try and get away from the stock images that use. The stock images used for vaccinations broke into either very generic images of people getting jabs, often in pain, and also those people tended to be white as well, or it was very comical images of people with giant syringes and things like that. You can imagine the kind of thing in a stock image library. Neither of those were particularly helpful at getting across the message that they wanted to get across. Now, bear in mind, vaccines and vaccinations is an area that has huge amounts of data in it. They already have the graphs to go next to this. They have the graphs about the efficiency of vaccinations, of what it means for the different rates of disease, but they need some actually compelling images to put next to them. So this library of images contains a diverse mix of people getting vaccinations. It tends to be reasonably happy. It doesn't look like it's an awful experience. It doesn't look like it's something traumatic, and it's specific rather than abstract. So the comical image of somebody holding a giant syringe doesn't do that relatability thing. It doesn't bring it into people's lives, whereas actually these kind of everyday images do. The Guardian as well made a specific point. This was actually just last month. The picture editor of The Guardian wrote a piece about how they reviewed and were changing their approach to images on environmental climate change news stories. Historically, they tended to do this kind of image, which we're very familiar with, the usual stranded polar bear on an ice floe. It feels like it's emotive and it feels like it's something that we care about, but it is incredibly abstract. I doubt many of us in the room have ever ever seen a polar bear or are ever going to go to the places the polar bears live. Now what they've done is they've stopped using those kind of images unless it's specifically talking about polar bears, and they've started to use images that have human beings in them. It's a specific push. So you will now see, if you look at Guardian stories, that they tend to have much more images of people in places affected in some way by climate change rather than the kind of abstract images. So feeding off the other points I've made, images are again a very powerful way of making this relatable to people. So giving them a lot of thought and trying to away from the kind of generic or you've seen it a million times before type images alongside visualizations. And this also feeds into infographics. Now infographics I think is a badly used format in lots of different places. Often because people slap over the top of graphs and charts just random images. So let's replace all of the columns with skyscrapers, if we're talking about the height of skyscrapers, for instance. But there are cleverer ways to integrate the two. I normally recommend to people that images next to the actual visualizations is the best approach. But there are instances of clever use of integrating them. Mona Shalabi, I believe she still works for the Guardian US, but she's certainly a very experienced researcher and data journalist. And she does this style of hand-drawn data visualization, which she puts out on social media. Now, these aren't intended to be the most accurate presentations of the data. They are, measured out. And they're also, this kind of way of presenting data wouldn't be appropriate if you were doing something like a board presentation or trying to convince a room full of data scientists. But on the wider web, they're incredibly engaging in a way that actually presenting the data in a more traditional format wouldn't be. This one here particularly has been passed around a lot of times online, including by Hillary Clinton. She retweeted it. Unfortunately failed to credit Mona Shalabi in it, which kind of built a layer of irony into that particular visualization, which probably wasn't intended. But the use of images, in this case illustrations, is a way of engaging people with subject matter that a standard presentation of a graph might not do. Now, bear in mind, it may be that this is the layer that you're using, this is the communication layer that you're using to try and get people into exploring the data in more depth. So one of the pushbacks I give on people saying that their data is too complicated to be able to dumb down in this way or to simplify down in this way is initially you're probably just trying to get people to engage with what you're saying. That's what you're trying to do. It may be that if we can link underneath this to where there is more data that they can analyse in a lot more detail and maybe see a lot more complex graphs and charts, that's fine. But this might be the best way to get their attention the first time they engage with you. So on imagery, are the images, that should say really relevant rather than relevant, are they specific enough to be exactly what you're talking about rather than generic image that you have seen multiple times before on other blog posts or other presentations about the same subject? Are they emotionally engaging rather than being abstract? Abstract images don't do very much. Images of people, images of the thing you're talking about happening, that's likely to be much more engaging than the hoodie guy from the Matrix if you're talking about cybersecurity. And will they tie into or help to drive the action that you're aiming for? You probably know how you want people to react to what you're presenting to them in terms of the data. You probably know what kind of decision you want them to take or action you want them to carry out. Do the images you're using align with that? Are they an ally of that? And then the next thing, which I've definitely seen come up as a challenge or as it's becoming a bit of a cliche when it comes to data visualization, is to talk about storytelling. Now you'll hear see lots of talks online, lots of blog posts, lots of people saying that we should include storytelling or use a storytelling approach to the kind of to our data visualizations. Now this raises for me, and I know because I get pushback on this, a few either misconceptions or concerns that people have about this word storytelling. The first one is that it takes us away from being an unbiased presenter of the data. It takes us into an area where we are cherry picking or skewing findings or being a bit of a propagandist in terms of our presentation of the data. Now, I'll come back to hopefully calming some of those concerns in a second, but generally I would say we probably are trying to tell a story if we're presenting data to people. It's about how we present that, how honestly we present that, rather than that we need to avoid in any way slanting the data that we're presenting. Or the other thing that I hear people saying about storytelling is they're expecting something quite complex and intricate. So a lot of the data visualization that we might see online, if you search for examples of great data visualization, or you look up great practitioners of data visualization, is things that have this kind of style to them. This one's from Georgia Lupi. She's an information designer who's a partner at Pentagram, a big design agency, and this is the kind of work she produces. Now, I love this kind of work. This is the kind of stuff that I do have up as posters on my wall at home. This is stuff that I would spend an hour with or more exploring and seeing all of the intricacies that are built into there. However, I think that this very design-oriented form of data visualization is generally not what we're doing 90% of the time, or 99% of the time. I think that this kind of presentation of this kind of visualization of data demands a huge amount of time and a huge amount of attention from our audiences, which generally in a professional setting you are not going to get. You cannot present data to your CEO and say, I want you to sit down with this for an hour and a half and just see where it takes you. That's not generally how CEOs want to be presented to. They want to know what the answers are as quickly as possible, and maybe be given the option to delve down into this much more detailed let's have a swim around layer afterwards. So because this is the kind of stuff that tends to get thrown up, particularly online, but also in magazines, on posters, this is where what people think we might be talking about when we say storytelling. I don't think we necessarily are. I think when I say storytelling, I think we need to have something that we're saying to people. And usually, when I talk to a data scientist or an analyst, and they've looked at some data and they're about to present it, they know what they're trying to say. What we need to do is make sure that we are grabbing people's attention and we are getting them to that message as quickly as possible. Now, rather than the kind of the idea that people are going to spend an hour and a half with something we produced and they're going to scan around it with their fingers and explore it in a lot of detail, I've got something with data visualization that I tend to call the commute test, which is if you are presenting something to people in a professional setting or at a conference, you're standing in, you've got some time in an executive meeting to try and get across your point. As much as you want people to be absolutely focused on you, absolutely rapt, they're hanging off your every word, most people will be distracted one way or another. They're thinking about the to-do list, they're thinking about the next meeting, they're thinking about the next agenda item on the meeting, that's in that meeting. So you need to assume that when certainly the first thing you show to people, and generally most of the slides that you're going to present, for instance, that you're presenting them in a way where people are looking at them while they're commuting to work. So maybe it's the poster that's opposite them on the tube while they're waiting for their train to come in, or it's when they're standing at they're at a red light and they can see a billboard across the road. That's the kind of level of attention that you can expect from people. So once you look at the visualization you produce, you need to think two things. Firstly, is it saying in that kind of time frame what I wanted to say, and is it potentially open to misinterpretation if people aren't really concentrating on what they're looking at? So storytelling is much more about identifying the message you're trying to get across and making sure it is as clear as possible. And there's lots of there's both sides of this argument have been written about a lot online from a data point of view about to what extent can we go into this storytelling. I like this quote. It's not the shortest quote, but I like this quote from Nick Enfield, who's head of the Post-Truth Initiative. Scientists do not have the luxury of foregoing storytelling. We do not need to fear that storytelling will compromise our objectivity. If we believe we have the right story, then we should tell it. And I think that's the crux. That last sentence is the crux of what I'm talking about. If you're unsure what the data says, then don't be confident about telling people that you do know what it says, obviously. But what I generally say to people is the story that's in your data, is it as clear about what you're trying to get across as what you would say verbally to somebody in a professional setting? That's the level of confidence you want to meet. So if I just said to you, okay, you've looked at that data set, just tell me verbally what are the things that come out of it, what does it mean, what should we be looking at? Most people I find are fairly confident in doing that bit. They won't overstate it. If something is a correlation, they won't say it's causation. If something is an indication that for further exploration, they won't say it's a definitive verdict. But they will have a level of confidence. Okay, this is what I think it says. When I then look at their visualization, particularly if they come from an academic background, there's nothing like the same level of confidence on that actual visualization. So it's about matching the two up. If you don't know what you're trying to say to people and you don't state it, then the person you're communicating with has no chance of understanding it. Think about it that way round. Now, one way you can get round the worry or the concerns you have about losing that objectivity, about potentially cherry picking or only showing one side of the story, is to and I encourage people to do this, think about splitting whatever communication you're producing into two sections. And these can be conceptual, or it physically can be the case. So imagining it physically, if this was a printed report that we're circulating around at our business, the front end of it is what I would call the story layer, the back end of it is what I would call the detail layer. If it's a bit more conceptual, maybe the story layer is what we present on our web page, and we link to somewhere where people can get access to the detail layer. If it was a PowerPoint presentation, maybe the slides are going to be the story layer, and the detail layer is a handout that we give to people afterwards, or that we just tell people they can ask us for if they want it. The reason for having these two spaces is, into your detail layer, you can put absolutely everything, anything you want to. Raw data, methodologies, all the things that you looked at that didn't come out with any kind of interesting point, all of that could go at the back. At the front, you only put the things that are in some way actionable, in some way important. And this is also where all of your visualization energy goes. This is where all of your thought about how do we present this all goes into those points up there. Part of the place you can claw back time in order to spend on producing visualizations well is by not wasting time visualizing things that just there's nothing to see here. A lot of that happens within organizations. People try and create graphs and charts by default, even when it's basically looked like the same graph for the last 6 months or a year. They're still going through the motions of producing it. This way round, all of the stuff in there can be left in table form or its raw data form. It's only the things that matter that we visualize. So a simple example of that. I see when surveys have been done, satisfaction surveys within a large organisation. They're done maybe annually and then they're presented back to the organisation. Even when they're designed really nicely and visualised really nicely, they're often in question order. Question 1, here's what we asked, here's a nice chart showing the results. Question 2, here's a nice chart, and so on. Now the problem with that is that questions 1, 2 and 3 in any survey tend to be name, age, job title type questions. They're just never interesting information. So I would much rather see a detail layer. Here's every question we asked in the survey in order with a table of results. It's complete, it's got everything there. And in the story layer, the 7 most interesting things that came out of this year's survey. That's just a very easy way of ordering the information so that the important stuff is first. It also means that we don't lose the objectivity and the completeness and the thoroughness because we do have everything else somewhere else. As long as people can access that, I don't think it's dishonest to be discerning about what goes into this bit here. The other advantage of thinking about it in this way is that we can then create a different story layer for our different audiences. So when I talked about tailoring to different people's motivations, trying to make it relatable to different audiences, then we can keep our detail layer the same. That could be a very bulky research document that contains all the data we looked at, but we will probably have a different layer that we're going to be communicating to our customers, to our fellow data scientists within our team, to our C-suite executives who just want a real basic summary of what it means for the business. So that structure allows you to think in terms of different ways of presenting things. And another much more pithy quote that I always come back to when I'm talking about this is this one here. This is a good way to think about what I've been describing. So Geoffrey Crowther was the editor of The Economist from the 1930s through to the 1950s. So it's a very serious publication with lots of data in it. He's a very serious man, as you can see. Very serious time in history over the Second World War. It's not like he's kind of an online PR guru who's putting out pithy blog posts. He said to his journalists, simplify and then exaggerate. And his point was, if you write for The Economist, you know everything about a certain subject, whether it's a part of the world, type of industry, type of business. As an expert in that subject, you should be able to pull out the one thing that everyone else needs to know about it right now. You should be able to use your expertise as a kind of filter to whittle it down to the most important point. And then once you've chosen that thing, you're going to then say why you've chosen it, why it's important, why it matters. You're going to do this amplification or exaggeration bit. The other things that you didn't mention, they will go lower down the piece, or you might put them somewhere else entirely, in your detail layer, for instance. So it's taking a very much news headlines approach to what you surface and what is worth communicating to other people. This then feeds into the design that you'll produce as well for your visualization. This starts to give you an idea of, okay, now is there anything we can actually leave out from this visualization? Is there any data points that, because they're not what we're talking about, can we leave them out entirely? Or more likely, can we include them, but can we just grade them into the background in some way or find a visual way to make it clear that they're not the important thing? And can we use a bold color and some other visual effects to pull forward the thing that we know that we want to talk about? And as a basic way of presenting a visualization that then fits into that story detail layer approach. These are the basic elements that I like to see around. It doesn't matter how complex the visualization is, this is a very simple chart, but these are the basic elements that I like to see around it that might be enough to add that storytelling element. Firstly, a descriptive title. A title that tells me why I'm looking at the data, why it matters, what I should be looking for, not the name of the data set. So the name of the data set can go somewhere down here. That is important. It is important to say what date range we're talking about, where the data came from, where people can go and look at it if they want to get more information. But the title should be much more descriptive. Now, I'm not saying it has to be tabloid descriptive, but it should be in some way give people the information they need to understand what they should be looking for here. And then room somewhere to add in some commentary. Now, commentary, not too much text, not too much narrative text, but something that might point out an aspect of this visualization, or might indicate the area that we want to delve into more, or might tell people what the action is they should be carrying out as a result of understanding the data that we're presenting. But there's a very simple way of presenting it, of visualizing the data. This should give us enough elements to add in that kind of storytelling focus. Now, in terms of if you're producing a bigger analysis, a bigger presentation, or a bigger, longer document, then you start to think about, is there a way to structure a more comprehensive narrative, an actual proper story? And there's lots of pieces you can read online about different storytelling structures that might apply to businesses. The simplest one that I encourage people to go for is the ogre approach, which is to identify what it is that is, usually we have a thing that we're presenting to people that is, here we are, here's where we are now, and here's where we want to get to, the happily ever after fairy tale ending. And in the way is either some kind of problem or some kind of piece of work that we need to do in order to take advantage of an opportunity. One of those two things. Identifying what your ogre is, that gives you the basic structure for a story that you might want to present in a PowerPoint form. This is where we are, this is what we've got in the way, and therefore what we need to do to slay that ogre. This is where we'll get to in the end. Missing out one of those things will not necessarily make it resonate with people. People need to understand the end point. This is the positives that we get out of undertaking this particular piece of work, and they need to understand in some way what the manifestation of the work that we need to do is, which is either the problem we're overcoming or the work we need to do to take advantage of an opportunity. Overly simplified, I know, but that is a basic way of approaching it. So in terms of storytelling, why do the audience need to look at this data right now, or this visualization right now? And have we stated that? Have we made it clear as part of the visualization and as part of the text that goes around it that this is why they're looking at it? Secondly, is there one story or many that we're trying to tell? Either many because we have an overarching point that we want to make, but there's 10 sub-points to it, that's fine. I would just treat them all as an individual story that you want to tell. Or because we have multiple audiences and we want to tailor a different story to each of them. Understanding that at the start, sketching it out on a piece of paper or putting post-it notes on a wall is normally the easiest way to get that clear in your mind before you get tangled up in the actual mechanics of visualizing something. And as a result of the story that we're trying to tell, is there anything that we can leave out entirely? Is there anything we can just ditch because it doesn't relate to the point we're trying to make? Is there things that we can put into a detail layer somewhere else that we can give people access to, but it doesn't need to be part of the communication that we're talking about? Or are there visual tricks that we can use, like graying things into the background or highlighting particular points to focus on the story, but not get too tangled up in the things that are less relevant? And the final thing I wanted to talk about before we get to a bit of summing up and then questions is the problem of uncertainty. Now, uncertainty, visualization of uncertainty is something that people are still working out the best way to do. Emerging best practice is what it tends to be called, which means nobody has the answers yet. Because inherently, visualizing something that isn't necessarily there or is there to varying degrees is a difficult thing to do. Visualizing things that are definitely there is obviously much easier. Now, people have experimented with various different ways of showing uncertainty, and you'll see a lot of them being experimented with, again, with the various elections that we either have going on in this country or in other countries around the world now or very soon. The Guardian is doing quite an impressive piece of work on trying to mesh together the various polls that are being used to track voting intentions in the general election, but also show the uncertainty within those polls. Polling is an area that's traditionally failed to in its visual component, to take any account of uncertainty. Often elections are shown as a kind of horse race between different candidates. Who's ahead now? Somebody's pulling level, somebody's pulling ahead. And all of those fluctuations tend to happen within the error margin of the poll itself. That certainly happened with Clinton versus Trump in the last US election. It was treated as if it was a narrow horse race, when actually nobody knew anything about that election from start to finish. What the Guardian is trying to do is take some account of allowing for that uncertainty by showing things like the grey different ranges around the actual lines that they're mapping. The other way that they're trying to do it is by adding, again, interactivity into the visualizations they're presenting. So that allows people to refilter the data and see how that affects the actual predictions by either adding different polls on top of each other or by changing some other aspect of the data that's being presented. Another group that's done this quite well is 538. 538 is a very good place to go to look at different types of visualization. They're a data journalism startup founded by Nate Silver, the stats guy. I know nothing about basketball and have no real interest in it, but I do think the way that they visualize often basketball statistics is quite impressive. And again, this way of using grey bars to show ranges and things in the background is something that seems to be pretty effective at showing where we think we are versus where this could actually be. So the greying out, it seems to be the prime way that people are attempting to show uncertainty. And the other way you can show uncertainty, or at least allude to uncertainty and allow for the fact that what you're presenting isn't a crystal ball. Because unfortunately with data science, as it's become more respected and more prominent and more a core part of how people make decisions, the expectations placed on data science have also become more and more extreme. So there is an expectation that you are dealing with a crystal ball and that what you will produce is the actual answers, even if you're talking about something that occurs in the future. But the greying out way of doing it is one visual way to do it. But also this is where adding things into your detail layer and referring to them from your story layer can be a good way of acknowledging the uncertainty that you might be introducing. So into the detail layer, this is where you can put your methodologies and explain what the weaknesses or the strengths of those methodologies are. You can add in caveats about the data, which might be to do with data you didn't have access to, or this is where things like bias that might be introduced by the data set you started with, you can allude to. And by including the raw data, you can also encourage other people to interrogate what you've done, run the same test themselves, have another go at visualizing what you produced. Those invitations will protect you from introducing uncertainty without necessarily explaining to people that it's there. So when it comes to uncertainty, do ask yourself if it's necessary to reference it. Sometimes it isn't, because inherently everything has uncertainty based in it. So the real world is full of uncertainties, and it may be overcomplicating what you're presenting in order to explain those all the time. But in cases where you know that there is an error margin that may be ignored or overlooked by the audience you're presenting to, you need to find a way of visualizing that and also stating and explaining that. But can you put that reference to the uncertainty or explanation as to how the uncertainty works somewhere else? Does it have to be on your visualization, or can it be pushed well back in your document or your presentation away from the visualization, just referred to? I hope I've explained that. So just a few points of summary, and then what I want to do is take questions, because I want to make this as specific as possible to people in the room. The things that I think have come up as the biggest trends this year, while I've been working with clients, while I've been working with different people who are presenting data, firstly are tailoring things to the audience that we're presenting things to. This has been something that I've talked about for a while with everybody that I've trained or I've done consultancy with. I think it's something that still gets overlooked. There isn't one way to visualize a data set. That's never true. There are multiple ways to do it. You just want to make sure that they are tailored to the audience in terms of their level of understanding, in terms of their motivations, what they're likely to be interested in, and in terms of the actions that they can carry out. Normally, if you're talking to different people, it's what they will do as a result of understanding the data will be different. Secondly, are we acknowledging and showing both the breadth and the depth of what we're talking about? That's the relatability point. Have we said how broad this problem is, or this opportunity, how many things it affects, but also how deep the opportunity is? How does it relate to an individual? How does it relate to one of our customers, one of the people within the data set that we're talking about? Are we using images in a smart way? Are we finding images that are engaging, relevant, and not too abstract, that actually tie in and add something to the data we're presenting, rather than just being a kind of random picture added on the side? And where there is uncertainty, where we know that there are issues with potentially the data that we're working with or the model that we're presenting that makes them less than a crystal ball, do we need to include those in some ways, either in the visualization or in the kind of caveats that we might add around the visualizations? So, with those things in mind, I did want to leave plenty of time for questions. Because I know that there are things that I won't have covered there. I tried to gather together the things that I thought were most pertinent from the last year. And there may be other aspects of data visualization or presenting things to non-data specialists that I haven't covered at all because I've done them in previous talks, in which case I'm happy to do it now. Now, does anyone have a question on any aspect of data visualization that they'd be happy to start with? Thank you.
Yes, about interactive charts. The end user can lack the tech knowledge, and I think that an interactive chart may scare him away, him or her. Do you have any opinions on that?
So the question is, with interactive visualization specifically, they can be complex, look very complex, and scare the user away. Yes. So again, I would. Okay. So a couple of things on that. Firstly, I think when you're presenting interactives, you still are thinking about, is this going to be intuitive for the audience? Is it going to be familiar to them what they're actually looking at? Now, one way you can always test this, by the way, is try and find a friendly representative of the audience you're generally targeting. So if you know that it's going to be something that's going to go internal at your workplace, can you find people outside of your data specialist department that you can just say, if I gave you this, what would you do with it? Do you understand it? The second thing with interactives is you want to give people the illusion that they can go swimming around anywhere they want in the data without actually allowing them to do that. That's normally the trick you're trying to carry out. So you want to be able to them to explore enough that it's engaging, but usually there are a few set paths that you are putting down into the data rather than millions of different ways that they can investigate it. The biggest advantage with interactives, with online data visualizations, isn't really anything fancy or clever. It's just the fact that if you're presenting data in a static format, so by that I mean PowerPoint printed documents, if you have a lot of data, you've only got two choices. You either put it all in one place and it will look very crowded and busy, or you run it across multiple pages or multiple slides and you end up with a longer document. You've literally only got those two ways to go. When you're producing things online, you have a third option, which is you can effectively stack those different pages of information back into the screen. And what interactives allow you to do is then to allow people to flip between those different layers and see different views. But you're still essentially presenting the same thing. You're presenting them one view on the data at a time. You're just giving them some agency about which view they see at any one time. So, and if it's an animation, it literally is a flick book through those different layers. So it's not anything like crazy clever you're doing with interactives, you're just slicing it in that way. And if depending on the number of questions, I can show you a couple of examples of that as well. Thank you for being first as well. Does anyone else have another question about any aspect of visualization? Question back there.
Yeah, so you often get feedback about what you visualize, and there is a need of updating it somehow so that the message you're trying to convey comes across better. But that process of updating I find that difficult sometimes, because maybe some people caught on the first time around, but then other people didn't, and then you update and it just causes confusion. And just in general, how should you use feedback for updating and changing what you're trying to convey?
Okay, so the question there is, you present something to people, you get feedback that it's not easy enough to understand, all the message isn't coming across, so you go back and make changes, but that's frustrating because some people did get it and you don't know entirely what changes to make. So a few things on that. One is when you're thinking about audiences, it gets more and more difficult the more diverse the group of people you're presenting to at any one go. So ideally you want narrow audiences you can tailor stuff to, and often that's not possible if you're presenting to quite a diverse group, say in a work setting. So inevitably there's going to be people who understand it better and lower people. The reason that mixed audience is a problem is basically you have to tailor to the lowest common denominator. You have to aim for the least knowledgeable person in the room, because otherwise inherently you're going to lose people. That will be dumbing down for somebody who's more expert. This is where that detail layer that I mentioned, probably if you're dealing with a room full of people, one of whom is a data scientist and the rest aren't, you're aiming your communication mostly at the people who aren't, but the data scientist is immediately going to want to see all the other pages that you had of research so they can go through it themselves, and that's kind of fine. That detail layer is there to deal with the experts, the people who do have the knowledge to be able to question what you're doing. But otherwise you're aiming for the lowest common denominator, or the biggest group of people in the room. In terms of how you fix it, it is a very frustrating area because what people say they want is not necessarily what they want. So this is a truth in all types of design, but it definitely goes for this as well. This is where the curse of can we fit it all on one page comes from. This is often the feedback you get, I just want it all on one page. What people are thinking about when they say can we get it all on one page is they want the key information to be on page one. And technically, if you put everything on page one, technically that's true. It will be there somewhere. You won't be able to see it, but it will technically be there. So you do have this problem of people not really knowing what they're asking for. But so I would say two things. The one thing is try changing the text that's around your visualization without doing too much like elaboration on the visualization. That title can be the most important thing that just frames up for people, this is why I'm looking at it, this is what I'm looking for, and then they understand the rest of it. So that's one thing that I would encourage you to look at changing. And again, the point I made before, when you're trying to work out what's the best way of presenting a certain type of data, trying to find a representative from the audience that you're generally going to be communicating with, and with minimal explanation, just show it to them and say, what do you understand from that? That's when you can test out maybe different options. That's when you can start to refine things based on a more honest feedback. It's kind of what a UX designer would do, is give something to a user and get them to use it without giving them any guidance, to genuinely see how they're going to interpret it. So that gets around the problem of what people tell you they want is not necessarily what they actually want. So I guess those would be a couple of ways I would approach it. Question down here.
What would be a good strategy in a situation when the data is already published, however there is an error in there, or the data changed in the process, but already wrong kind of visualization got to people, and we would like to remedy that mistake, so some sort of versioning of the...
So you've published some data, there was an error in it, there's already visualizations based on that error that are being moved around. How do you then combat that, I guess? And would this be data published by your organization? Yeah. So that's an interesting point. It's impossible to do it like a product callback on those kind of communications, unfortunately. There's no way to get them back from where they were. And I mean, just that Trump map I showed at the start, once they're out on social media, they tend to be spreading independently and everything else. So I would say the only real approach, and this is more like a content strategy point of view, is to make as much noise as possible. Like, we feel bad about admitting mistakes publicly, but actually, particularly when you're from a science background, it's a very honest and good thing to do. We should be reviewing what we're doing all the time and saying, okay, this is a correction. I would say where you make the amends maybe on your website, don't just amend everything and make it so then you can't see that the correction's been made. The best practice, and you'll see this on most reputable news sites, is to put somewhere what the correction is and when it was made. So you've got a clear, almost like a versioning kind of documentation. Maybe it's at the bottom of the article where the data set appears. Secondly, then try and push out the corrected version of the data, making as much noise about it as possible. Maybe saying, this is the old version, here's the new version. This is the reason why we've corrected it. So it's being as honest and actually as loud about that correction as possible. I don't think you would obviously change the data to correct it on your website, but I think indicating that it has been changed is the thing that you should include, so that it's not just invisible to people. Like one day you change the data set, correct it, and there's no way to see that, if that makes sense. But the only place you can really acknowledge that versioning is on your own, wherever the data is actually hosted, I think. I'll go there and then I'll go to you. Hi.
Hi. Just wondering if you've got any advice around how we can incorporate data validation into how we're visualizing something.
So can you give me a use case of that? So that's how do we incorporate data validation into visualization?
Data quality measures. So I work in a hospital, and sometimes people may be entering wrong things into systems, and we want to kind of try and incorporate that into the report so that there's a feedback loop.
Okay, so the data isn't necessarily robust because people are entering the wrong thing, or are entering it, leaving stuff blank, something like that, and you want to be able to visualize. So I would count that as a separate visualization. So this often happens in places like hospitals. So example, like a project that I encountered reasonably recently was about how quickly people were discharged, and there was a big problem with people remaining in the system. It appeared that they'd been on a ward for 2 months, even though they'd been discharged after a day, just because it had never been recorded, or they'd been duplicated in the system. That then affected how the department of the hospital was judged in terms of their performance and potentially targets, that kind of stuff. I would say it's probably a separate visualization, going back to particularly the people who are doing that data entry, to show them again, going through this process. This is the number of errors we have. This is what that means for you. Like you're going to get judged on. This is what Care Qualities Commission is going to come in and judge you on in terms of performance. This is also potentially affecting our finances. This is how this particularly affects you. But doing it as a separate visualization rather than trying to include it on the visualization that you have. On the visualization that you have, that comes into the uncertainty bit, I think, where you would need to caveat somewhere, based on the data, this is what we're saying. The potential problems with the data, we will have to note and say, you might be able to estimate what the average error is for each of those data points, based on historically how far out have we been when we corrected it. But I would say they're two separate communications. One is the visualizing what we have based on the data we've got, acknowledging that there might be some errors in it. And the second one is purely going back to the people doing the data entry. This is the errors we're getting, and this is what that means for you, for your department, for your team. Does that kind of make sense? Great. I think we had a question here.
Yeah. So where you've got, 2 dimensions of results, so you've basically got category count. That's quite easy to display to someone. When we kind of go to maybe like a 3rd dimension, or even a 4th, you're kind of in the territory of bubble charts, heat maps, those kind of things. For a non-technical audience, have you got any advice for trying to display that to them?
Yeah. I mean, there isn't necessarily an easy way to do that. I mean, you could have multiple, like 2D charts next to each other that try and show different facets of the same thing, but then you get into the abstract again quite quickly for people to compare. Sorry, the question I should read about the room was what happens if you've got 2 data points that fit neatly on a line chart or a column graph, something like that. That's easy enough. But if you add in a 3rd dimension to that, then how do you visualize that for a lay audience again? Now, bubble charts, I would say, are becoming more mainstream. They still require explanation. And so when I say stick to the charts and graphs that people learn at school, that would definitely be true for communicating with a lay audience where you're not going to be there to be able to explain it to them. If you add in something like a bubble chart, I wouldn't put a bubble chart in a report and expect that people are going to be able to understand it. But if you're presenting it to them in a slide format, maybe if we're now going to regularly report this in a bubble chart, part of your initial communication is going to be how you interpret that bubble chart. Because bubble chart is useful for being able to add that 3rd dimension over the top. If you imagine the now late Hans Rosling, if anyone, you probably have come across Hans Rosling, you can find him, he did a TED talk, he did some work for the BBC, there are talks of his online, essentially using bubble charts to track wealth and population through history. Those only work because he is there, freezing them, pointing stuff out, circling trends, almost acting like a weatherman to point stuff out. But once you have seen him do that, you can then log on to the tool that he's got online and be able to see different patterns yourself. So I would just say, again, that opportunity to educate bit, I would say that's what you need to be able to do. There isn't a way to sort of trick it without running separate graphs to add in that 3rd dimension. So, yeah, being there to explain it, or potentially adding, you could have an instructional video on your website that talks through, freezes it at points, talks through this is what's happening in the Hans-Rosling style way, and then give people the bubble charts that they could interpret. Question here, then I'll go there, then I'll go there. Hi.
In other talks, they discuss quite much about AI becoming a sort of not a replacement, but helping more and more in data science activity. You think that that would be the case also for visualization, or you think that an expert will always be necessary, at least to write compelling stories? So
this is how will AI and machine learning affect visualization? Will it become effectively automated? I mean, I think that's already happening to an extent. Most business reporting dashboards or business intelligence tools are effectively doing some automation. They require configuration, but they're doing some automation. So I can look at my latest website traffic or my latest finance performance, and it will automatically show me graphs and charts that it's produced from the data. So that layer of tools is already there to an extent. I still think that what automation tends to do, and this is historically how it's always worked, is it will take out that report, that visualization that you have to produce every week based on a certain type of data. It will automate that kind of regular work that doesn't really change, which is great. What it will then free you up to do is the stuff that is more bespoke, requires a particular human analysis, thought about how it's going to be presented, because there isn't necessarily a formulaic way to do it. And that's really where your energy should be going anyway. The stuff that is really important, really bespoke, really different to what we do on a day-to-day basis, that's where your energy needs to go. So definitely machine learning will automate a lot of stuff in the background, and it should. We don't want to be manually producing stuff over and over again. Normally, if you found a good way to present a certain type of data, you want to reuse it as many times as possible. At that point, machine learning should be able to say, for that type of data, this is the best chart, this is how we'll present it. One of the things that machine learning will be slower to do is adding in those kind of caveats about the quality of the data, or elements of context and uncertainty that are, what it will be able to do is read the data. It won't necessarily be able to judge the quality of the data. That's where you might need human narrative. So I think they'll work together. Automation already here in some tools will increase and will hopefully take the grunt work off us so that we can do more complex stuff, I think. One of the things, though, on machine learning and AI is that is going to be something that we are going to have to get used to explaining to people. So if you imagine if an insurance company currently says your insurance is more expensive because of your postcode, or because you've had car accidents in the past, your car insurance, then that kind of makes sense to people. If it's a machine learning model that has found either a way of judging people for how expensive their car insurance should be that we as humans don't understand, or it's found a correlation that actually people who are ginger and are born on Tuesdays tend to crash more often, then we're going to have to find a way of explaining why that has made your car insurance more expensive. So explaining machine learning models and AI models to a lay audience is a whole next step in what we're going to need to do. There was a question, thank you for that. The question there.
What are you thinking, for example, to apply some general rules on colors used for database? Background black for presentations in the evening, light background for presentation in the daytime, and same for bright colors and lower values and
Okay. So use of colours. So generally, I would say as long as it's readable, that's fine. I use a mix of black on white or white on black, and I think they both are very legible and very clear. There's kind of a design trend more broadly into using darker colours because dark mode appears to be on every type of software that we might use. In terms of then colours beyond that, I tend to say, firstly, use intensity of colour to signify importance. So that is very bold, dark shades down to very, very light shades. The easiest way to say on a visualisation, this is there, but it's not what we're focused on at the moment, is to make something grey, and then it is visual, but it's dropped into the background. So intensity of colour. Intensity of colour has other advantages. It will work for people who are colourblind in ways that certainly reds and greens might be problematic. It will also work if people print it out on a black and white printer, which if you work in the public sector is definitely a consideration for your visualisations. So intensity of colour, definitely. And then in terms of colour meanings, some of these we know from branding. If you walk around the supermarket aisle, you know the work that's been done on different colours and what their associations are. Some of them have quite a specific meaning within visualisation. So red, for instance, in packaging is quite an active, pioneering, bold colour. Red is also love, lust, Valentine's Day. Red on a visualisation means bad, and it will always mean bad. So you have to think about it in that context. That's true even in the Far East, where red is a very lucky colour. Look at how the stock market's reported. Downwards red triangles, red lines, bad. So you have to think about what those colours mean within a visualisation. And two things I would say there. One is watch out for blue. Blue is a very calming colour. Blue is the sky, blue is sea, blue is chilled out. Lots of technology companies use blue in their logos for that reason. People find technology overwhelming. It's there to say everything's fine. You're getting trolled on Facebook, lines between everything are blue, you're in a safe space. That's what it's trying to say to you. Primary NHS colour is blue for that exact reason, because it's a very reassuring colour. That means that blue on a visualisation is usually a good colour to use for things you don't want people to look at or worry about. Pardon?
ODSC logo.
Yeah, again, technology. People find data science overwhelming. It's all a bit complicated. Don't worry, it's all chilled out. It's going to be fine. Airline seats tend to be blue. There's loads of examples of blue in very supposed to be calming situations. Also, that means don't be forced to use your brand colours or your organisational colours on visualisations. That's something that I have lots of fights with people about, normally communications teams. Because your brand colours were invented to say something about your organisation, they may mean something very different if you use them on a visualisation. So if ODSC was using their brand colours on their graphs and charts, it will inherently make them not very punchy and not very engaging, because it looks like everything's fine and there's nothing to worry about. The NHS suffers from this problem. I see a lot of blue charts in the NHS because they're using their main colour, and as a result there's no sense of urgency. Now, around the edges of slides, title pages of reports, use your branding, that's absolutely fine. On visualisations, be prepared to have a much wider use of colours, I would say. There are also, from just a design point of view, there are tools online called either colour palette generators or colour wheels. They're usually free to use. With those, you select a starting colour and it will give you a complementary palette of other colours. So that if you're not a designer by nature, and I'm not really, then that's quite a helpful tool as well. And I think there was a question further back, but maybe that person has left already. Any other questions? Oh, over here, sorry.
Yes, talk about simplicity of charts and things uncomplicated.
Yeah.
But catering for colourblindness and visually impaired, would it be better just to offer one chart that meets all criteria, but then potentially, going back to your last point, you're talking about colours on a certain thing, or going for buttons so you can switch? Because a lot of web pages, or some web pages, they'll offer what their ideal, but then they'll offer buttons at the corner to select according to particular user's needs.
Yeah.
What your thoughts are on the best way to manage that?
Yeah, so that is should you produce one visualization that caters for people who might be colourblind or have other needs, or do you allow for the options, particularly online this would be the case, and you're right, on web pages you can change colour schemes and things like that. Just from a resourcing point of view, I would say if you're producing something manually, then being able to produce it once is probably better. And if you follow the basic rules of, again, using intensity of colour, which will be visible to everybody, then that shouldn't cause too many problems. If there is an efficient way of allowing for different options so that people can adjust them, then yes, I would say that's the ideal, but how much work you can put into achieving that ideal might be more of the barrier. But generally I'd say if you make it so that it's accessible to people who are colourblind and potentially have sight issues that would mean that, you know, very similar colours are going to blur together with each other, I think best practice would be cater for those people anyway, and then it will still work for everybody else. And that intensity of colour thing should work. I mean, bear in mind, if you're dealing with accessibility online, your fallback position really is it needs to be accessible to someone who is entirely blind or registered blind and using a screen reader to move across the page, which reads out what's on the web page. Now, obviously, with visualization, you can't necessarily cater for that. Then all you're talking about doing is having a meaningful description, meta description on the image, on the graph or the chart or the other image, so that it will make sense in that situation as well. Two questions here. I'm going to go to the person in front and then to you behind. Hi. Yes.
What's a successful example of graphical visualization on mobile?
On mobile?
Yeah.
Most of the visualizations that I see online are mobile responsive these days. Because the websites they're attached to tend to be. I'm just thinking if I've got a specific example. I mean, one tool that I would recommend having a look at if you want to see what's possible with visualizations, and potentially you'll be using a different tool to actually produce them, is a new one that's called Flourish. Again, it's nothing to do with me. It's created by a pair of people who, they were a web developer working with a data journalist, and they were producing JavaScript graphs and charts for kind of The Guardian, people like that. Now they've created a tool that allows you to produce those graphs and charts without doing any JavaScript coding. Is basically what they've done. I'm just going to find an example. I'm just going to see if this one is mobile responsive. So this is one of their examples of visualizations, which is about 6 years. No, that's not going to do it. But this example, because it goes back to the very first question, which was about layering and how and whether it's off-putting to people. This example here is which company is called Global Warming. This is about 5 years old now, or 6 years old, this visualization. Obviously that would be technically called a sunburst diagram. They're not very usable if you use them see them in print or on posters, but in interactives they are. I can see it's basically nested pie charts, so all emissions breaks down into top 90 producers and other, and then I can see investor-owned, nation-state, state-owned, but down the edge of the circle I can't see what's going on. All other is greyed out, so we're already not talking about other, that's gone. But if I click on top 90 producers, that becomes my 100%, and if I click on investor-owned, that becomes my 100%, and then I can see BP, and if I go into BP, I can see fuel and cement, methane leaks, own footprint, and in terms of an action, that bit says BP has caused 2.47% of man-made carbon emissions tweet. If I click that, it sends out a tweet, and I can go up the tree. Now this is a very elegant piece of data visualization. It gives the illusion of being able to explore in multiple different ways. However, it actually just gives me the ability to dive down in very specific paths into the data. Now if I just quickly show you Flourish, so the people who built Flourish, and they now have all of these different visualization styles. Some of them are static, but they have animated versions. They do things like bubble charts, but they will produce things like a sunburst diagram that has basically the same functionality. This one's breakdowns of studios that goes down into different types of movies. I can go back up, and all you need to do to produce these is put your own data into them. Now these, I'm pretty certain, are responsive. What you would get at the end of the process for producing one of these is an embed code, so a snippet of HTML that you can put into a content management system to put on your website. Now, they're basically producing JavaScript in the background. If you had access to a JavaScript developer, you could do a lot of this stuff yourself. They're trying to remove the pain point for non-coders, but it's a useful place to look to see what's possible in terms of different types of graphs and charts, and these are getting very trendy online as well at the moment, which is actually using animation, I think, to add a third data point in this case. These kind of bar chart races, again, you just have to put the data in to produce that. Sorry, I'll go to you first and then I'll come to you. Hi.
I was just wondering if you'd be willing to share any mistakes that you've made either recently or earlier in your career that you have learned from.
So many mistakes. So that is, have I got any mistakes I'm willing to share? Yeah, I mean, I'd say generally this has just been a complete ongoing learning curve for me. It's been quite. I got into data visualization and working on that from working in magazines, where I think magazines were much more focused on the aesthetics of it than the actual accuracy of the data being presented, and that's where I would see a lot of stuff that I still see today, which is thinking something looks like a boring bar chart and starting to add pictures over the top of it, or we're talking about deforestation, let's turn all the columns into trees. Those kind of decisions, what I would call decoration, are generally mistakes that I would have made in the past that I say don't do that. Decorating something never works in terms of adding to the impact or adding to the accuracy of it. Images next to a visualization, photos or illustrations, that's a good idea. Clever use of colours to highlight the right points, but all the design decisions need to be functional, not decorative, I would say. And you can see some truly awful infographics online when people have gone wholly down the decorative route. So I'd say that's probably a mistake that I've historically made, that I've realised that's not the way to go and had to sort of reset. What other mistakes? I still make the mistake of not tailoring to the audience enough. Like I find this, although I really enjoy talking to this crowd at this conference, it's quite a tough crowd in the sense of there is a real mix of people in the rooms with different motivations, and it's not always easy for me to get access to those in advance to understand what people are trying to get out of it. Hence I leave a lot of time for questions so that I can deal with that. That is still a problem, that going in blind into rooms is something that I still do. I think most of my other problems are just quite practical ones about presenting stuff. So, for instance, I've learned through bitter experience over the years of having control of only using my own laptop to present things, not relying on someone else's. That's often a disaster. Things like I have, although it doesn't look very nice, I have a bottle of water that I use for talking, partly so I don't get dry mouth, which often happens, but also because once a few years ago I was demonstrating a new product, a data-heavy new product, to a team of CTOs who'd flown in from all over the world, and in the first 5 minutes I knocked a glass of water over my MacBook Pro. And so it was then, Macs and water is not a great combination, so it was then a race against time to demonstrate this thing before the entire thing just frazzed out. Hence I now have a water bottle with a screw top. So it's a lot of practical stuff that I now think about in advance that I wouldn't have done before. The clicker I use partly, I'm close enough to do my laptop. This I find stops me either starting to throw pens around, which I've occasionally knocked into the audience in the front row, or constantly checking that my flyers aren't undone, which is like a paranoia thing that male speakers get particularly. It just gives me something to do with my hands. So I'd say a lot of the problems I've had are much more practical. And also, when I do presentations, all of my slides, I don't tend to use animations, and I don't tend to do a lot of stuff that connects to the web, because I've had disasters about that in the past. And we've all sat, and when we're waiting for a presentation to start, somebody tries to get the video to work and realizes they haven't embedded it in the right way. So those technical problems. So I know that they're not so much to do with visualization, but those are the things that I've realized. You want to have control of your environment so that you can focus on the message you're trying to get across, I think. There was another question here, and then I'll go to you at the back. Right?
Yeah, so my question is, that the starburst looked really cool, but it was difficult to read because you can't really tell what an angle means. So it's kind of like you have to put the value into the cell to say what you're looking at. So that's basically what's your feeling on using donuts and pie charts. And then the second part is where you're having labels with the data. Would you keep it on the axis as well, or would you simplify charts and just have values at point of?
I think so. So the first question is so I guess sunburst diagrams, pie charts, donut charts. I think so. Pie charts get a bad press because I think they're used really badly a lot of the time. Partly, basically on a basic pie chart, you want about 8 segments as a maximum, and you want one of them to be bigger than the others. If that happens, the pie chart's brilliant. If that doesn't happen, the pie chart's normally terrible. So lots of tiny slices doesn't work. Several equal size slices, like a Trivial Pursuits piece, doesn't work. And part of the reason why that happens is because they used a lot in dashboards. So dashboards, my definition would be anything which is a regular presentation of the data where the presentation stays the same, but you put new data into it each time, whether it's live online or it's like a weekly thing that people go through in a meeting. But if you use pie charts in that situation, you don't know what the data is going to be at the point you decide to use a pie chart. So then when it comes in, you do get lots of tiny slices, or you get equal size chunks. So pie charts are bad because they're not used for the right purpose. Donut charts, I think, I don't have a problem with them from a legibility point of view. I mean, they are just hipster pie charts. They use because they've got a slight design aesthetic to them. You can put something in the middle, like an icon or an annotation. That's the only real advantage to them. And then sunbursts for me only work if they're interactives. So that one there, it needs to at least intrigue you a bit to press something. Once you press something, I think you start to understand the data. I think looking at it static, I don't think you do, even though they are used in magazines and in posters and things like that. And your second question, and on any of those, so for those I would say, so sunburst only interactives, pie charts, donut charts only when the data is going to fit them. And normally that's really simple data, which is, it's like weekly sales type data. It's not anything more complex than that. Where you've got more complex data that is segments of a whole, tree maps are being used, I find, a lot more often. So some kind of oblong split down to segments. It's able to cope with more segments, and it works either static or as an interactive as well. In terms of labels on the actual graph, it's a bit more of a judgment call. Once you've decided what the key message is you want to get across, does adding those add to that? I think as long as it doesn't make it too messy, then it's probably a good idea. Can you only add those labels to the points you want to highlight? So once you've decided this is the column this is the column that needs to be what people focus on, maybe the annotations just go on that and everything else is there as a kind of just relative scale so that people can look at it. Less is often more from a design point of view, but the line of where you're crossing into inaccuracy is what I guess you need to be careful about. Thank you. There was one question at the back.
Yeah, one of the problems we have in data science is when stakeholders think they know the answer before you even do the analysis. Are there any good tricks of visualization to try and communicate a message which you know is the opposite of what people have gathered in to hear?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So that is this is essentially people know the answer they want to hear and they basically want you to present it back to them, which is a broad... Yeah, and you're coming back with an answer they probably don't want to hear. Yeah. And so that's wider than visualization. That's a data science problem and you will often get asked this as any kind of person who works with data. We want this to be true. Go away and prove it. It's kind of the brief that you're given, and that's not your job. That goes into the audience motivation bit. It is always worth asking yourself when we present this back: are people going to want to hear this? Are they going to be receptive, or are they going to be hostile to it? If they're going to be receptive, don't waste too much time on making the most amazing presentation in the world, because actually they're just going to sigh with relief and say brilliant, and they're going to move on, so you can make it in a very short space of time. But you need to prepare more for the hostile situation. And maybe just acknowledging up front as this is probably not what people want to hear, but this is what the data says, based on our opinion. Bear in mind, again, that story is just what you would be confident saying verbally to people. It just needs to reflect that in the visualization. But I think acknowledging this is not maybe the answer that people want, but this is what the data says, rather than hoping to slip it past them or hoping that, dealing with it in a different way, is probably the only thing you can do. In terms of the visualization, I think you can probably prepare for the questions you're going to get asked if it's going to be a hostile presentation. So either build those in as this is the first view of the visualization. This is a visualization that's going to answer the first question that I know you're going to ask. This is the one that's going to visualize the second question I know you're going to ask, and then be prepared for the other ones, maybe in a more of a Q&A format. But you definitely have to batten down the hatches and brace for when you know you're doing that. But it is your job to do it. And unfortunately, this is still a misinterpretation of what data science is there to do, as much as it is anything to do with visualization or anything else, I think. I think we've reached the end now. So is that right? Yes, we're bang on time. So thank you all for coming. I hope at least some of that was useful. I will be available around if people want to ask me for questions one-on-one, but otherwise I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And if you need to find me online for any reason, I'm very easy to find online, so feel free to drop me a line if you've got another question as well. Thank you very much.